everybody, welcome to the Dibley Diaries for this week. It has just about stopped raining enough for us to record outside, so I'm hoping we can get the recording done before it starts pouring down with rain again. This week we're going to be thinking about home and what it means to go home, thinking about the Bible passage for this week, and home and where you live in a village is a very interesting thing. Some people who live in a village will live in houses that their ancestors have lived in for hundreds of years. It may be that some people will live in a place where they can trace back 200, 300, 400 years of their family living there. But a lot of people, if they move around in a village or move into a village, will live somewhere where someone else has previously lived. And for a long time, one of the places where we lived in a village, I had to say, oh no, we live in this house, and it had a name, and I'd say the name of the house and no one would know where it was, and then I would say, oh, it's their house, and use the previous people's names, and they go, oh, you live in their house. And there's something about how when you live in a village there's a continuity which is more to do with the people and the community than with the actual name or number of a house. So you might live in so-and-so's house, or you might live in so-and-so's house, or you might live in the vicarage, or you might live in the rectory if you're the vicar. So one of the things about understanding what home is really intricately linked to the sense of what a community is. And so lives in a house, or it might be in the post office, for example, or somewhere which has an idea, an understanding of your role or the place that you are filling or replacing in your village community. So when you go somewhere, someone might even give you directions. Well, you know where so-and-so used to live. Well, you go past their house and you're there. Or, well, you know that house, they used to live there. So part of understanding what home is in a village context and understanding who we are and how we live in a village is to do with how we relate to the community. Not only the community now, but possibly the community from 10, 20, 30, 40 or even 50 years ago. The reading for this week is from the beginning of John chapter 14, where Jesus is talking to his disciples about going ahead of them and preparing a place for them. He says, in my Father's house there are many dwellings, and I go and prepare a place for you, and you know the way to the place where I am going. Then Thomas pipes up and says, Lord, we don't know the way, how can we know the way? And Jesus says to him, I am the way, the truth and the life. So that's the reading for this week. And I found myself thinking about home and homes this week. And I started thinking about tracking. I don't know if any of you did any tracking with the Cubs and the Scouts or with the Brownies and Guides, but the sign for going home is a ring of stones or a ring of sticks with a stone in the middle. It's a sign which just says, go home. Go home now. The tracking is over. You've finished the trail. Go home. Where is it you think of if I were to say, well, go home? Where is your home? What is your home like? What do you think about that? One of the old ladies that I knew and loved dearly wanted us to read this passage at her funeral, and she was most particular that she wanted the King James version of this passage, because instead of dwellings, it says, Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many mansions. That's the translation. And she loved to think about it as that, because she used to describe herself as born a lady but came down the wrong chimney. Born a lady but came down the wrong chimney, and she wanted to think that at her funeral we would be reading the passage which says that she was going home to her mansion. Now that might seem petty, but there are other ways of thinking about that we'll come on to. The Scots have a good way of distinguishing about where is your home and where you're currently living. So if someone from Scotland says, where do you stay? Where do you stay? That just means the place where you're currently living, the place where you're living now. It could be for work or for some other circumstance, for studying. It's just the place where you are living now. Where do you stay? And for people who live in tied accommodation, then that is a very clear question. Well, we stay here, our job brings us here. Where do you stay? Where are you from in Scotland is a different question. That is the question about where is your home? Where is your home? If we were to make that circle of stones with the stone in the middle, where would you go home to? Where are you from? It's different from where do you stay. Where is your home? I was working in a placement 20 years ago in a very large parish church, in parish church building. It was a part of a big town. I was giving people communion from a chalice, from a cup, which was gold with precious stones on it. I now realise it was probably silver gilt. A gold cup like that would be too heavy and not strong enough. But this golden cup with stones on it, and it disturbed me, it perturbed me, this cup, because we could hand it over halfway to people and they could grab hold of it and use it to guide the wine to their lips, but we weren't allowed to let go of the stem in case they nicked it. And it worried me that that wasn't really a very good thing that we were doing, not necessarily a good use of resources. But other people challenged me about this, and they said, well, you remember, Janet, that the images that we have about heaven are to do with God's plenteousness, the image of a cup brimming over with wine at the feast. And so for those people who came to communion and were given communion wine from that cup, it should remind them about this generous love of God, how he cares for each of us. And that is part of what thinking of heaven as our mansion and our home and being a bounteous place is about. Jesus calls us home. And we think of heaven as Christians, as home, as a place where we are going to. At the funeral services where we have this reading, I normally say kind of just this one thing about this passage, but I kind of hope it's all I need to say. When Jesus replies to Thomas and says, I am the way and the truth and the life, he's answering Thomas's question, how do we know the way? How do we know how to get home? How do we know that to follow that sign, the circle with the stone? How do we get home? Because obviously if you're tracking, you can go back, you can follow back the way you came, but you can't do that in life. There has to be a different way from that sign, the going home sign to Jesus, to getting there. And Jesus says, I am the way. And what I say is that it doesn't matter if we don't understand the mechanism of how it works, because Jesus will sort that out for us. Jesus will sort that out. I mean, we're quite lucky I'm not on a train sermon today. We'll save that for another time. But if I was going to use that allegory here, we don't need to understand how the train works. We just need to get on the train. Jesus says to Thomas, I am the way, the truth and the life. And when we come to our sign, our ring of our circle of stones with one in the middle, our call to come home, Jesus sorts out our way for us to go home to that place that he has prepared, a dwelling or a mansion which may or may not have a golden cup. For this week's Dibley moment, I was thinking on the theme of home and houses and living in a village. And when we lived in a vicarage, in a village, quite a large village actually, things would appear on our doorstep because people knew where we lived. So things would appear on our doorstep at home, usually they were good things. I mean, post that was delivered to the church might reappear on our doorstep, which was a good thing because we didn't live in the church building, we lived in the vicarage. But then people would drop off apples or plants or things that would be delivered to I might deliver to somebody else. There would be all sorts of things which would just arrive on our doorstep because people knew that we lived there, and that was fine. People dropped things off. And I was trying to think what my favourite things that had arrived on the doorstep were over the years, and probably, I guess, we used to often get big boxes of apples to sort of share around with the church community, and sometimes plums, things like that. People would leave excess produce with us to share around, and that was really good. But I guess the best story about having something left on your doorstep is not my story, but is something which happened to my mother. So many years ago, this would have been in the 60s. She lived in a small East Anglian, quite a rural community, and she was known as someone who would know things. So someone came up to her and said, "Do you know anything about poaching?" She thought they meant like poaching eggs or poaching fish as a cooking technique, and she said, "Well, I guess if you go to the library, there'll be information in the books there about poaching." So imagine her surprise 3 weeks later when 3 pheasants turned up on her doorstep overnight, because obviously someone had found out about poaching at the library. And that's all for the Dibley Diaries this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, and however many people make their homes there, have a really blessed week.